Well, welcome to my camp. Just come close to the fire so I can see you. And go ahead and take your moccasins off if you like. Just cozy up to the fire, and we'll have some s'mores. And I'll tell you stories. I'll tell you things you need to know. 'Cause you're tuned in to the All That Chazz Stress Relief Podcast. Welcome. Today on the podcast, we're talking about sensory deprivation tanks, the joy and relaxation found in old movies, also the inspiration found there, and an update on what's been happening with me and why this podcast has been delayed. But delayed no more. I have returned. Muha. Muhaha. Etc., etc. Hey, sit right back and I'll tell you a tale about sensory deprivation tanks and more on the All That Chazz podcast. All That Chazz, Stress Relief. So, the other night I was sitting on the couch and I thought, I'm going to have some bonding time with my son. I'm going to expand his horizons, expand his mind. And I thought, we need to watch a cult movie together, something that is a classic, something that he'll refer to in later years and help guide him and inspire him. So, of course, I looked on Netflix, and the first thing that popped out as a cult classic that lasts forever is Office Space, with Stephen Root and a bunch of other people who sadly have, I don't know what they're doing now. Hopefully they found some job outside of the food service industry. I don't know what they're doing. However, charming show, really loved it, and of course that was by Mike Judge from King of the Hill fame. And Mike Judge doesn't make enough movies. I just love Office Space, and Jennifer Aniston is also in it, so we know what happened to her. Anyway, we're watching it, and I get a little flash of light after a while. The glow of the screen has done something to me, and I think, was that in real life, or was that just my vision? Was that in real life, or was that my vision? Was that in real life? And I just saw this streak of light, and I thought, this is how it begins. This is the terrible illness that will befall me. So I thought, don't panic. I'm a master of stress relief. I will just wait and see what happens, because this is not a panic. And so, of course, I go to bed and I go to sleep, and I wake up the next morning and it's worse. And I look up in the sky at night, and I see a little flash that is the same as my pupil. It's like I'm looking into or my iris. It looks like I'm looking into a mirror, but just in a flash. I thought, that doesn't sound good. So that morning I called the optometrist, and I talked to the receptionist for a minute, and she says, just a sec. And I thought, she's consulting with the doctor. This might not be good. And then she comes back on and she says, well, your doctor isn't available, but someone else is standing in for him, and she wants to see you today. So see you at 3:50. And I went, okay. And I showed up, and long story short, because, there a lot of hilarity ensued, but in the end it all came down to, it was not a detached retina, which, by the way, if you have a flash through your vision, you get that checked out so they can deal with it before it becomes blinding. And it turned out to be something less serious, but something they could deal with. So that was one thing, and then quickly followed by an issue with infection and tax season and whatnot. I just had to prioritize, and quite frankly, I've just been ill. I've been not up to it. So that's what happened with me. But my only point is, do take care of your vision. And if you do get some kind of symptoms, you don't know what's going on, go see your doctor right away. I often say that on this podcast is, don't take health advice from a podcast. Go see someone in person so they can look at that thing on your back and say, oh no, that's not a massive growth. That is a zit. That was charming, wasn't it? Hey, but it's true. You got to take care of yourself. So I'm taking care of myself by getting out of my home office and going to my other office. It's a quiet Sunday afternoon, and I thought this is a great time for me to sit back, sip some coffee, and reconnect with my podcast listeners with a new episode of the All That Chazz Stress Relief Podcast. So, a couple things while I was dealing with some stress. One thing that I found helpful is I get a lot of joy out of watching old movies. And it's not an old movie, like Office Space doesn't really count as an old movie. It's an old movie to my 14-year-old son, but I like black and white movies. I like really, not really old, but pretty old, like Humphrey Bogart vintage stuff. I watched Key Largo last week, and I watched The Sweet Smell of Success. And you know what I notice about those old movies? There's no CGI, so it has to be more clever. I'm looking forward to seeing Guardians of the Galaxy, and I think that'll be funny and awesome, just like any movie with Robert Downey Jr. would also be funny and awesome, and why don't they make Iron Man movies every month? So it's not like I'm crapping over anything that's new. It's just that one thing I notice about old movies is I think they had to be more clever because the dialogue is sharper, funnier, faster, more. I just love old movies. And if you're looking for a distraction, whether you're in pain or whether you've got stress or whether you're decompressing from doing your taxes, as I was, I think that watching an old movie can really, or rediscovering an old movie. I love the noir oeuvre. God, I hate noir oeuvre. This, that's right. I'm an East Coast liberal elitist. Because only if you are a East Coast or West Coast liberal elitist can you possibly say those sorts of things. Yeah, I love those old movies, and the other thing I find in them is it's sobering, but it's also motivational. Maybe not inspirational. Maybe not inspirational, but certainly motivational. I've watched a bunch of old movies, and when I'm watching old movies, I can't seem to help myself from wondering what happened to these people. Because I think it's in George Carlin, an old George Carlin joke about how when he watches an old movie, he goes, "All these people are dead," as is George Carlin, sadly. And I watch these old movies, and I look up, what happened to these people? As they had fabulous lives, many of them, and many of them had pretty short careers. Some of them had long careers, but they all had careers of note, and they're on IMDb, and they are remembered by the larger culture in some way, and in film history they're important even. So I was watching Breakfast at Tiffany's, for instance. I love two things that Truman Capote wrote. One is In Cold Blood, and the other is Breakfast at Tiffany's. And I do recommend the book. There's a element of the movie Breakfast at Tiffany's that is incredibly racist, and Mickey Rooney, I think we can all agree, lived too long. But when you look through the IMDb, you think, wow, what happened to those people? And this gets down to the motivational part, is how short life can seem, and how, like, if you're working in a dead-end job that you hate, I think life can feel really long and interminable, and you're worried about your future, and you're worried about, how am I going to eat when I'm 80 if I live that long? And you can develop a lot of worries and headaches that way. When I look at the lives of old movie stars and see how they ended, I think what it does for me is motivate me to try to do more with the life I have, with the time I have. Because, it is amazing to see that George Peppard, who I grew up with as Hannibal in the old A-Team show, which wasn't really good but was watchable, when you're a kid. George Peppard was a real heartthrob in Breakfast at Tiffany's. And after a multifaceted career, he ended up dying, I think, of pneumonia, and is buried with his parents in Dearborn, Michigan. And Audrey Hepburn, who, there's a moment in that movie where she is looking over her glasses and she has the eyes of a deer. She has huge, huge eyes. And she's under a hat that would look ridiculous on anybody else. And she's looking over her sunglasses. And you think, oh my God, that long neck, that perfect face. She was gorgeous. And she died of appendicular cancer. Her appendix was cancerous. And, think of if that had been removed when she was younger. Maybe she would live forever. I don't know. It seems crazy to me that somebody would die of appendicular cancer. That's the only case I've ever heard of appendicular cancer. It seems so random and ridiculous. But life is often random and ridiculous. So she died too young. George Peppard died too young. But wow, what a ride they had. They still had, even though they died relatively young, they still had amazing lives, amazing careers. Audrey Hepburn was in ballet. She had iconic roles. She was a model. She was discovered young. She, whether you love or hate George Peppard's work, you have to say, that guy was at one point a movie star. And a little bit of him still lives on in these movies that are Turner Classic Movies, are still on TV. It's not all about Hannibal on A-Team, which, admittedly was ridiculous, but not bad, just fun. And that's really, I guess it is aspirational, really. I was thinking, life is short, so that's your motivation. No, it's aspirational in that these people did something that lasted. And everybody dies, but not everyone lives. And they had great lives and great careers in many ways. And I wish that for you as well. So that's my thought on old movies and how they can be motivational and, yes, even aspirational. And finally, I want to talk today about sensory deprivation tanks. I actually wrote a novel in which sensory deprivation tanks are a key component of the story. It's called Dream's Dark Flight, and it's a Dimension War novel, and I love it. It is fantastic because I love sensory deprivation tanks. My first experience with sensory deprivation tanks, or isolation tanks, or float tanks is what they're called now more, was in 1986. I was a young journalist, campus journalist. I took a journalism degree, and they were giving out these floats to try to get college kids and people on sports teams and all that sort of interested in this new franchise that had started up. And at that time, everybody knew the movie Altered States, and it was kind of an attempt at a revival, because float tanks are. Here's the experience. You take a tank with warm water that's close to the temperature of the human body, and it is filled with 2 tons of salt. So it's like floating in the Dead Sea. It's incredibly buoyant. So you become an astronaut. You are floating outside of gravity. So if you have a sleep disorder, if you have chronic pain, if you have arthritis, some kind of injury, if you just want to reduce your stress, as long as you don't feel claustrophobic and panicky in the dark, these are things that these float tanks can be very helpful. Some people use them for psychonautic exploration, which I focused on in my novel. But it's actually a medicinal tool in many ways. It's just a great way to relax. I found it very relaxing. I loved stepping out of gravity and feeling like an astronaut. And I was reminded of that because I did it again recently. And I did it as a couples float with my wife. It was her birthday. And I bought us a float in a isolation tank together. And yes, there was a sexual charge to it, but don't have sex in an isolation tank. That's rude. And it smelled weird because they have a lot of chemicals and lots of salt. and hydrogen peroxide in the water. But the filter is very, very strong, and I really enjoyed the experience again. And I want to do it some more because we have a new float center in my city. The At one point, laying in the water, I did a side bend, and when you do a side bend, laying on your back, you're not really aware that there's any resistance. But if you do a side bend on your back in an isolation tank, supported by all that, the buoyancy of the salt out of gravity, you really get a sense of how much resistance there is in normal life when you're dealing with gravity, when you're in gravity. There is resistance there even when you're not really aware of it. It's just your body adapts to it all the time. You know how if you have your hand behind your head for a long time and then your shoulder is a little bit stiff as you bring it forward sometimes? When you are out of gravity and you have your head behind your hand behind your head, can't seem to say that phrase. When you have your hand behind your head and you bring it forward and it doesn't hurt at all when it normally does, that's you getting out of gravity. There's no pressure on your joint. It is. I came out of it feeling really mellow and relaxed and energized. I get disoriented in the tank because at first we started off with a little bit of light and music, and I cut the music and cut the light, so it was total darkness, and it was wonderful. Now, there aren't a lot of these, depending on where you are, you may have to travel a while to get to one of these tanks, but if and when you do, I highly recommend it. I felt, as far as the medicinal benefits, I'll say two things about that. One is, aside from being a sci-fi and horror author, I'm also a massage therapist. I've typically got 4 jobs. Right now I've got 3 jobs, and one of them is running a publishing company. And I work in 2 clinics. And I had someone come in who was suffering from sleep deprivation. She was obviously exhausted all the time. She had incredible chronic pain. And just as you could tell just walking in that she was not having a conversation with gravity. She was fighting gravity. She was fighting to stand up. She was having such a hard time with so much pain. And I did my work, which what I say about massage therapy is it only feels like magic. It's actually physics. But we increased her range of motion in her neck, and she had no pain after I was done, but she still looked, she still looked exhausted. So I'd never recommended this treatment for anyone before. This float center is new to my city. It wasn't an option before. But I actually did recommend that she try out going into a float pod and getting out of gravity. Because one thing that I noticed, because if you've been listening to this podcast for a while, you know that I also have a sleep disorder, which I manage quite well these days. But after I had my flotation isolation tank sleep sensory deprivation experience, I slept better for the next 4 or 5 nights than I had in a long time. It had a residual effect that I could only attribute to the amazing experience of getting out of gravity for an hour and relaxing in a sensory deprivation tank. So do try that out if you have the opportunity, because it is a wonderful experience. As long as you don't have a fear of the dark, or if you're afraid of tight spaces. We were actually in a couple's room, so it was quite a large float tank, but if you have claustrophobia, it might not be for you. But even so, even if you do have claustrophobia, if you leave the door open, or the lid open, then maybe it won't bother you. So it's something to explore. And that is it for today's podcast. I want to remind you all that we are back weekly. I to broadcast weekly, just not for the last couple of weeks because of all the illness and aggravation. But I am on the mend. I also want to remind you that we have a catchphrase contest. If you can come up with a catchphrase that I can end this podcast with, then I will send you a book. I will send you Do the Thing in paperback, which is a fabulous book that you need to put on the back of your toilet tank because you can pop in and read a chapter, and no chapter is very long, so you won't risk hemorrhoids, and you can get a really nice little nugget of information that will help you with life management. And life management consists of managing your stress, managing your pain, managing time, and managing energy. So do keep that in mind and email me at the show link at allthatchazz.com. It is expartepress@gmail.com. Email me with your catchphrase suggestion. If I use it, you will be getting a book from me. Thanks for all those who consider the Patreon page. You can become a patron by clicking the Become a Patron button at allthatchazz.com. And when you use that link, you will be taken to a page that shows you all the rewards that you can get for helping to get this podcast out there, help with the bandwidth costs, and make it pay. So I have a coughing fit about to start, and I've already talked too long, so I will talk to you again next week on the All That Chazz Stress Relief Podcast. Thanks for listening.